At 6:47 a.m., the U.S. government kicked down a door it never needed to break. The flashbang didn't stop an attack, didn't save a life, didn't interrupt a ticking clock. It simply announced the end of a story that had already been written. 12 federal agents stormed a cramped Chicago apartment and dragged a barefoot 27-year-old out of bed, still in his pajamas, blinking under rifle-mounted lasers. No weapons, no getaway plan, no manifesto taped to the wall. Just a laptop, a messy room, and a man who had already been watched for months. This wasn't a race against danger. It was a collection. Because the FBI didn't catch him in the act, they observed the act documented. It approved it and waited. For 7 months, they watched this man steal millions of private emails from one of the most powerful intelligence contractors in America. They saw every intrusion, every file transfer, every late-night decision. They could have stopped it with a single phone call. They didn't. Instead, they let it happen, because the most trusted person in the hacker's world, the voice guiding him, encouraging him, calming his doubts, was working for them. The raid wasn't about what he took. It was about what he learned, about what he saw inside systems never meant to be seen from the outside, about secrets that exposed how corporations spy on activists, how intelligence becomes a commodity, and how power operates when no one is watching. This is not a story about a hacker who went too far. It's a story about how the state manufactures its own criminals, how trust becomes a weapon, and how truth once uncovered carries a price far higher than most people are willing to pay. Stay with this story, because what happened next forces a question that doesn't go away. If the system can let a crime happen on purpose, who is it really designed to protect? Jeremy Hammond did not wake up one morning and decide to become an enemy of the state. He was built slowly, predictably, by a system that mistakes obedience for stability and calls dissent a defect. Long before federal agents memorized his screen name, Jeremy was a teenager in a quiet Chicago suburb, teaching himself how the internet worked, so he could help small anarchist groups build websites, organize protests, and print underground newspapers no one in power wanted read. While most kids were learning how to fit in, he was learning how narratives were controlled and how wars were sold. When the invasion of Iraq unfolded on cable news, Jeremy organized walkouts at his high school, not because it was popular, but because silence felt like participation. That instinct to act when something felt wrong never left him. By his early 20s, it landed him in federal prison for hacking a right-wing group and redirecting stolen funds to charities. The government labeled it fraud and identity theft. Jeremy called it redistribution at the speed of a click. Prison was supposed to correct him. Instead, it completed the transformation. Inside concrete walls and fluorescent light, he learned a brutal lesson: the system does not reward conscience, it punishes disruption. When he walked out 2 years later, he wasn't humbled, he was hardened, angrier, clearer, more certain that symbolic protest meant nothing to institutions that operated without consequences. By 2011, Jeremy was living in a cluttered Chicago loft, surviving on coffee code and conviction, watching police crack down on Occupy Wall Street while banks received trillion-dollar bailouts. Something shifted. Small hacks felt pointless. Pranks felt childish. If power hid its crimes behind servers and secrecy, then that's where the fight had to go. What Jeremy didn't know was that this clarity, this moral rigidity, made him the perfect candidate not just for resistance, but for manipulation. Trust online is not built through handshakes or eye contact. It's built through presence, through someone who is always there when the doubts creep in, who answers at 3 a.m, who speaks with confidence when everyone else hesitates. That is how Sabu entered Jeremy Hammond's world. In encrypted chat rooms filled with aliases and paranoia, Sabu stood out immediately. He was experienced, decisive, endlessly calm. He knew which targets mattered. He knew which lines not to cross, or so it seemed. More importantly, he believed. Or at least he sounded like someone who did. For a hacker who had learned that isolation was the price of conviction, that kind of certainty was magnetic. Jeremy didn't just see Sabu as a collaborator, he saw him as proof that he wasn't alone. What Jeremy could not see was the second room behind the screen, where federal agents logged every message in real time, where targets were reviewed, greenlit, and quietly monitored. Sabu had already been arrested. Faced with decades in prison and the threat of losing the children in his care, he broke within hours. From that moment on, the relationship Jeremy thought was built on shared risk became something else entirely, a controlled environment. This wasn't the FBI watching a crime unfold. It was the FBI shaping its direction. When Sabu encouraged Jeremy to push further, to aim higher, to take risks that felt bold, but calculated, those words carried institutional weight. Every reassurance we're safe, they can't touch us, was typed with government approval. Jeremy mistook consistency for loyalty, mentorship for solidarity. He didn't realize that his confidence, his momentum, his sense of inevitability were being carefully cultivated. The most effective trap is not built with force. It's built with trust. By the time Jeremy began to feel the pressure, the sleepless nights, the creeping paranoia, the sense that something was off, Sabu was already there to steady him, to keep him moving forward. And with every step Jeremy took, the case against him grew stronger, cleaner, and more devastating. He believed he was choosing his path. In reality, the path had already been laid. Jeremy didn't stumble onto Stratfor by accident. The deeper he followed the threads Sabu kept pulling, the clearer it became that this target was different. Stratfor wasn't a hacker trophy or a symbolic hit. It was infrastructure. On the surface, the company sold geopolitical analysis, the kind executives skim over coffee and government officials cite in briefings. But once Jeremy began examining job postings, client lists, and internal references scattered across the open web, a darker picture emerged. Stratfor recruited heavily from former intelligence officers, offered private sector salaries for public sector secrets, and operated entirely outside the mechanisms meant to restrain state power. No elections, no oversight, no public accountability. This wasn't intelligence gathering in the name of national security. It was intelligence as a service sold to whoever could afford it. As Jeremy mapped their digital footprint, he realized Stratfor's real product wasn't information, it was leverage. Their clients weren't asking what was happening in the world. They were asking who needed watching, who needed neutralizing, who might disrupt profit or stability. Activists, labor organizers, environmental groups, survivors of corporate disasters seeking justice, ordinary people who posed no threat except the possibility of embarrassment. Stratfor tracked them quietly, methodically, and invisibly, compiling dossiers that would never appear in a courtroom or a congressional hearing. For Jeremy, this was the moment the story stopped being abstract. This wasn't a corrupt company cutting corners. It was a parallel intelligence apparatus doing the work governments couldn't do openly anymore. When other hackers warned him off, when they called it a hornet's nest protected by powerful interests, Jeremy understood the risk. He also understood the stakes. If Stratfor stayed hidden, this model would spread unchecked, privatizing surveillance and insulating it from democracy. Breaking into their servers wouldn't just expose emails, it would expose a blueprint. Jeremy wasn't chasing chaos, he was chasing visibility. And what he didn't yet realize was that as he prepared to shine light into one of the darkest corners of modern power, someone else was carefully measuring how far they'd let that light travel before snapping it off. The breach itself should have been impossible, and that was the first shock. Stratfor sold intelligence to governments and Fortune 500 companies, yet its perimeter cracked under pressure that would embarrass a college ET department. A simple vulnerability, a weak password, doors left open by people who assumed no one would ever dare to try them. When Jeremy slipped inside, there were no alarms, no frantic shutdowns, no evidence anyone even noticed. He moved carefully, deliberately, expecting resistance that never came, and that absence of friction made the moment heavier, not lighter. What waited beyond the login wasn't a jackpot, it was a reckoning. Directories labeled with client names, subfolders tracking movements, meetings and internal disputes, reports written with clinical detachment about activists, labor organizers, environmental groups, people whose only crime was challenging someone more powerful. Emails read like office gossip, except the subject matter was surveillance, intimidation, and quiet retaliation. Jeremy felt his pulse climb as the scope revealed itself. This wasn't security. It was management of dissent. The deeper he went, the worse it became. Files on disaster survivors seeking compensation. Intelligence paid for by corporations trying to get ahead of lawsuits and bad press. Conversations that treated human suffering as a variable to be minimized. Then came the emails, millions of them stretching back years, documenting relationships between executives, contractors, diplomats, and spies who spoke freely because they never imagined anyone outside the circle would listen. Jeremy didn't cheer. He sat still reading until dawn, understanding that this was no longer about exposing hypocrisy. This was about exposing architecture. He knew that simply copying the data would change nothing. Stratfor would apologize, patch, and continue, so the decision hardened. The system itself had to feel consequences. Databases were wiped, backups shredded, the company's digital spine severed, and in a final act that would later be weaponized against him in court, stolen credit cards belonging to Stratfor's elite clients were charged with donations to humanitarian organizations, money rerouted from surveillance to relief. It was symbolic, defiant, and irreversible. When the dust settled, Jeremy wasn't holding stolen secrets anymore. He was holding a mirror up to power, and once you do that, there is no safe way to put it down. Jeremy believed the worst part was over. The data was secured, the handoff was in motion, and the world was about to see what had been hidden for years. In his mind, the danger now lived somewhere outside his apartment, in courtrooms and headlines still to come. What he didn't know was that the most decisive moment had already passed quietly without drama. Every file he thought he was sending forward had already been copied. Every plan discussed in encrypted chats had already been archived. Every moment of doubt he had confessed late at night had been preserved word for word. When federal agents finally moved, it wasn't with urgency, it was with timing. The arrest came not because the government feared what Jeremy might do next, but because they knew exactly what he would do and wanted to stop him just before it mattered most. Sitting in a holding cell, flipping through the charging documents, Jeremy's eyes caught on a recurring phrase, Confidential Witness 1, CW1. The transcripts were too precise, too intimate. Conversations only one other person could have known. That's when the realization landed heavy and disorienting. The voice that had guided him steadied him, pushed him forward. The friend he trusted more than anyone in the underground had never been on his side. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was total. Every memory rewired itself in an instant. Every reassurance became manipulation. Every encouragement became instruction. This wasn't just the collapse of a partnership. It was the collapse of reality as Jeremy understood it. He hadn't been running alongside a brother in arms. He had been walking a path lit deliberately, step by step, toward a destination someone else had chosen. By the time he understood that the trap was already closed and there was no version of the story left where he walked away intact, the courtroom was quiet in the way institutions prefer, controlled, formal, stripped of context. By the time Jeremy stood before a judge, the story had already been simplified beyond recognition. There was no room for motive, no space for intent, no interest in what the documents revealed or why they mattered. What remained was a narrow frame access damage punishment. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, a law written decades earlier for a different internet, was stretched until it fit whatever shape the prosecution needed. Jeremy wasn't described as a man who exposed surveillance. He was labeled a threat, a warning sign, an example. The fact that the government had watched the crimes unfold in real time, that an informant had actively encouraged each step, was treated as irrelevant. Opportunity was enough. Choice was enough. Context was disposable. When his lawyers raised conflicts and contradictions, the system absorbed them without changing course. This wasn't about weighing facts. It was about restoring control. Jeremy understood that instinctively. When the moment came to speak, he didn't perform remorse. He didn't apologize for revealing what powerful people preferred to keep buried. To do so would have meant agreeing that secrecy deserved protection and that exposure was the greater crime. The sentence reflected that refusal. 10 years, the maximum. Not calibrated to harm, but to message. As guards moved in, the lesson became unmistakable. The punishment wasn't just for Jeremy. It was for anyone watching closely enough to imagine doing the same thing. In that room, justice didn't pretend to be blind. It looked directly at the disruption, measured the embarrassment, and responded with force. When the doors closed behind him, the case was officially resolved. What it left unresolved was far more dangerous, the knowledge that truth, when it challenges power too directly, is treated not as a public good, but as a liability to be eliminated. When Jeremy Hammond finally walked out of prison years later, the world he had tried to expose had not collapsed the way headlines once suggested. Stratfor lost contracts, executives resigned, and journalists mined the leaked emails for years, uncovering scandal after scandal. For a moment, it looked like sunlight had done its work. But systems like this don't die when they're exposed, they adapt. Private intelligence didn't disappear. It fragmented, rebranded, professionalized. Surveillance became quieter, better funded, more legally insulated. The architecture Jeremy revealed didn't vanish. It evolved. Meanwhile, Jeremy emerged into a narrower life than the one he left behind. He was free to breathe air that didn't smell like disinfectant and concrete, but his freedom came with conditions: restricted access to technology, constant monitoring, borders he couldn't cross. The cost of knowledge followed him outside the prison gates. And yet the impact of what he did could not be erased. Activists learned how closely they were watched. Journalists gained a roadmap into corporate intelligence networks that had operated invisibly for decades. Ordinary people saw, perhaps for the first time, how power behaves when it assumes no one is looking. That knowledge didn't spark a revolution, but it changed posture. It made people more careful, more skeptical, harder to manage quietly. This is where the story turns inward. Jeremy paid a decade of his life for information that now circulates freely in newsrooms, classrooms, and activist spaces. Was it worth it? He has said yes. But the more important answer doesn't belong to him. It belongs to anyone who understands this story and recognizes its pattern. Somewhere right now, someone is sitting alone in front of a screen, holding access to something powerful people would rather keep hidden. They know the risks now. They know how betrayal works, how justice flexes, how punishment is calibrated not to harm but to deter. The question this story leaves behind is not whether truth matters. It's whether we are willing to bear the cost of knowing it. This story isn't really about hacking. It's about power, how it watches, how it waits, and how it punishes when exposed. It's a warning that systems don't always fail loudly. Sometimes they work exactly as designed. Jeremy Hammond's case shows what happens when truth collides with institutions built on secrecy. The individual absorbs the cost so the structure can survive. The lesson isn't simple, but it's urgent. Understand how power operates before you challenge it, and never confuse visibility with safety. If this story made you think differently about justice, accountability, or courage, help it reach others. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep investigative stories that don't flinch from uncomfortable truths.